My guest this week is an author and academic, but she is more than that. For me, she is one of the most important voices in the 21st century in this country for various reasons, but not least because of her work around class and social aspects of that. And for me, her book Getting By was one of the most influential things I've ever read. In short, it was because finally I read something and I was like, yeah, that person understands, and I relate to all of that, and I've seen all of that, and finally someone who's lived it is actually writing about it, instead of Owen Jones writing his book about chavs, looking from the outside in, as it were. She is a real inspiration and a really, really sharp mind, and it's a real pleasure to have her on Topple Uncaged. It is Lisa Mckenzie. Lisa, thank you so much for agreeing to come on. It's great to have you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for that. That was a brilliant introduction. I don't think I've ever been introduced that great before. Brilliant.
Well, it was, seriously. I remember when I bought Getting By, and I started reading it, and I was kind of like, oh my God. There was one bit which stood out for me, and I always remember it, because you spoke about the sort of rat runs that ran through the rows of housing in the estate. And I'd never read anyone or heard anyone talk about that before, because I was like, that is the back of my old house, because we used to get where I used to live. It was converted sort of workers' houses from the sort of mid-Victorian times, and it was surrounded with workers' houses and council housing. And these rat runs were like prolific, because at the back of our garden was a drop-off point for knock-off goods, and we used to have about every week the police banging down our back door because there'd been some stolen shit dropped off at the back of our garden. But it just summed up the book for me, because you could tell that you lived in that kind of community and lived that kind of life just by the way you wrote and everything about it. It really struck a chord with me, and it's one of those books that will stay with me forever. So I haven't had the chance to ever say that to you before, so I want to say it now. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. When I was writing that book, I was just writing about where I lived. To be honest, that's all I was doing. You know, I mean, there's a brilliant bit that it caught me. I was thinking about just walking through one of the underpasses one day, and you walk under the underpass and it stank of piss, because everybody pissed in the underpass.
Yes.
But then when you came out of the underpass, you smelt all the clean washing what people had put on their gardens. And I just remember thinking, you know, the smell of piss and then Purcell. And so you know, that kind of. And that's how I really thought about where I lived. It was this, you know, it was piss and Purcell. You know, it was, on one hand, you know, it was the loveliest, sort of cleanest, wonderful smell in the world. And then in some parts of it, you know, in the same part, it was like stale urine. So, you know, when I was writing, all I was doing is writing about what I was, you know, my life, really. The next book that I've...
Carry on, sorry.
The next book I'm writing, really, it'll be exactly the same. You know, it's about what I see, how I experience it, and obviously, like you said, as a working class woman, I'm experiencing the world in a particular way, which is not the same way as, you know, Owen Jones or the people who work for The Guardian. They're not experiencing the world in the same way that I do or you do.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for our voices to be out there.
No, absolutely. And that piss and Purcell analogy is just brilliant, because it does kind of sum up kind of working class life, as it were, because you, on the one hand, you've got sort of pockets of maybe deprivation or issues or anything else, but then you've got the pride in the fact that people are hanging out their fucking washings and they're making sure they're clean and they're making sure, do you know what I mean? That's a brilliant...
Yeah.
It's a brilliant analogy. It's excellent. This is... you have no idea how excited I am to talk to you. This is brilliant. However, I'm going to try and control myself, because this is a professional outlet. So we have got, anyway, Lisa, down to business. We are talking through 3 stories today, as always, on this section of Topple Uncaged. We've got one story which is chosen by myself, one story which is chosen by you, and one story which is chosen by a Twitter poll. So we're going to kick straight off with the first story, which is yours. And this was a segment on Newsnight this week, which was about what it called the asylum crisis, but more it was about the issues surrounding the housing of refugees. It had Andy Burnham, that delightful man who's currently Mayor of Manchester, on, and it was talking about the sort of squalid accommodation, but moreover the fact that many councils are now not taking their refugee quota to house them. Now, this made you really angry, and it can be seen through your Twitter feed, and a lot of what you're saying, I was like, yes, I remember that, yes, because you wrote about that part of that situation, but also how the situation with asylum seekers, immigration and refugees in this country ultimately would impact on Brexit, because you wrote this in 2015. But why did this section of Newsnight, what got your goat about it so much? What wound you up?
I don't think it was just that some of us knew this from a long time ago, from years and years ago. I mean, I started thinking and writing about this. Well, I started thinking about this from about 2003, 2004, because I used to live, like we were saying, I lived in St Anne's in Nottingham, which is a council estate, which it's one of them council estates where people tell you not to go. So they'll go, don't go to that one because, all the drug addicts are there, all the drug dealers are there. But, it was my home for 20 odd years. And that's not how I saw it. I didn't see it as a dangerous place. But what it was also seen as a place where you could dump people. And after the Iraq War, or during the Iraq War, I would say for the small area that it was, there was a large amount of asylum seekers or refugees being dumped in St Anne's, where I lived. Mostly they were men. And the council, I mean, one day, 20 men appeared in the middle of the estate, and they'd been basically just dropped off in a block of flats, and they'd been left. Now, this is how I started to think about this, because over the next sort of 6 months, 20 men became 50, 60, 70 men, and in a council estate that was, mostly families, kids, elderly people, to have that number of people from the outside, and particularly old men, being dropped off in such a short space of time without anybody sort of explaining to anybody who they were, it really did start to cause a lot of tensions. Now, so what I was not angry about really, was the fact that there are places in the country that we think we can just dump people in, we can drop them off, that it doesn't matter, that the existing people that live there have got no say, but also the people that are getting dumped off are being left absolutely unsupported in the poorest areas that just don't have the resources. So about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote about this in The Guardian, and I was writing about both things really, the way that some communities are treated as dumping grounds, but also the way that the people that are getting dumped really are just being left without any support. So I wrote this article 4 or 5 years ago, and this was part of my PhD research. Okay. So it was well researched. It went into The Guardian, and basically I was absolutely vilified as a racist. So I was called a racist for saying these things. And then 4 years later, now people are sort of saying, oh, this is a problem. Well, I was saying this a long time ago, but people just didn't want to hear it.
No, absolutely. And I think there was a particular tweet you put out, which was basically saying if people had sort of not necessarily listened to you, but listened more broadly to what working class communities were saying, I suppose is what you're getting at, then Brexit might not have even happened anyway.
Yeah. I mean, that's what the Newsnight report was saying. What it was saying is there were places in Manchester and in Nottingham and in Barnsley, in Yorkshire, Sheffield, that for a long time has been worried about it's not just refugees, it's just about the general state of how people are living. Their living standards have been dropping and dropping and dropping, and nothing that they are saying or raising has been listened to at all. And so the refugee problem was only one problem, but it was an issue that people were raising, and it was an issue that people were being ignored on. And I think Newsnight is now, was saying last week that it was relevant. This is relevant to Brexit. And I think it was relevant to Brexit, but, it was only...
it would have been relevant 3 years ago to Brexit, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been relevant, it was relevant 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But again, nobody was listening. And I think one of the reason I wrote that article in the first place was not because I was thinking about what, where refugees would live. Or the problems they may cause. That was not what I was saying. What I was actually saying was, at the time, I don't know if you remember, there was, everyone had just for the first time realised that refugees were coming to the country and they were not, they were not being treated very fairly. Things like they were being put into houses in Middlesbrough and having red paint on the doors to let people know that they were refugees. So for the first time, I think the middle class had started to recognise and perhaps starting to get a bit of a guilty conscience that this was happening. And so what started to happen was Caitlin Moran and Yvette Cooper and everybody else who lives in Islington started sort of saying, we're going to house 3 asylum seekers in our house. We've got a spare room, and they started coming on television and on panel shows saying, we all must house refugees. We all must have them in our homes. But the reality is that was never going to happen. Refugees were never going to go into Islington or Chelsea or any of the sort of gentrified areas, because what they're doing, and this is not just for refugees, this is for everybody, they're moving the people that they value the lowest, so I call them devalued people, and they're moving them to devalued areas. So the places that had been deindustrialised all over the north and also in Kent as well are now of low value. And so what they're doing is they're moving people of low value into those areas. And that includes working class people who live in cities. It includes refugees. It includes migrants. It includes the elderly. It includes disabled people. It also includes looked after children. So, there's these areas all over the country that are not worth that much. And the reason that they've been devalued is because they've no infrastructure, no bus routes, no jobs, there's no infrastructure. And so what seems to be happening is the poorest people are being shunted to the poorest areas. It's a ghettoisation, really, of this is what's happening. So I was trying to discuss this 4 years ago. But of course, it became impossible because the minute I started to discuss this and say, look, in reality, refugees will be put in the poorest places with people who are already struggling. You can't have that debate in this country.
No, you can't. But that was, there's sort of, I remember that article really, 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 really well because I read it and reread it, and also because I totally understood where you were coming from, but also I know why these people are calling this racist. And for me, it was 2 issues. Firstly, that you were saying that unspoken truth that no one wanted to hear, that working class white people was generally are not actually racist. What it is, as you just pointed out, that people, refugees, immigrants, whatever, are being moved into their communities when their communities are already fucked anyway. And essentially, it's a reaction to the fact that we already can't get a doctor's appointment. We already don't have enough buses to get us around. We already can't get jobs, etc., etc. And you want more people to come into our communities. It broke that misconception about sort of white working class communities being racist, and that is, of course, uncomfortable for the liberal middle class. Yes. But secondly, what it also did, Lisa, and I think this is for me the broader point with this, it exposed the fact that over decades and decades and decades, the working class communities, and especially white working class communities, have been failed by neoliberalist capitalism, which parties of all colours have been responsible for. Because what you had, essentially, you had obviously the Thatcherite deindustrialisation, then you had the sort of triangulation of the Blair-Clinton era, which made everything PC, all the working classes were split up into their own little groups of LGBT, of of whether you were, what colour your skin was, what religion you were. We were all broken up intentionally, I think, as well. That was an intentional splitting of the working classes. And what your column put so sharply into focus was the fact, well, it's now come to bite you on the arse, all this policy that you had done of the past 30 years. And that was for everyone, Labour, Lib Dems, Conservatives, all of them alike. And that column really rattled some feathers because it was far too close to the truth.
It did. And I think now there's sort of 3 or 4 years between it. I think perhaps people might read it in a different way now. And I think post-Brexit, it reads quite differently to how it read before Brexit. So it's quite interesting, really, the way that politics is moving. You know, the things that we could and couldn't say before 2016, and now these truths are being exposed, and now the arguments that we can put forward. But I think as before Brexit, this was a truth that we couldn't say. Yeah. Post-Brexit, we seem to be able to talk about this now. Yeah. And the consequences there are real consequences to what happens when people have no control over their lives. And I think this is what immigration has always represented to the poorest people. It's about having no control over your life at all, because you feel like, you're in a position that you just can't possibly share anything else. And then, whoever it is, the local council, the government, whoever, or the media are telling you that, you're racist. And then, that more people are going to come in, and more people who are desperate, who need help. And one of the things that always comes out through my interviews that I do with people, so, when I was interviewing this group of women in 2004 or 5 in St Anne's in Nottingham, not one of them said they didn't want those people to live there. What they were saying is that it was always them that had to bear the brunt of it. And so this is what they were constantly saying. So it wasn't that they shouldn't live here. One of the things actually they kept saying is, imagine what it feels like coming from a war-torn country and then you have to come to this. Because they knew what their estate was like. At the time in Nottingham, there was issues around drugs and gangs and guns, and one of the things the women kept saying is, imagine coming from a war-torn country and then you're coming into our estate where our kids are fighting each other as well. Imagine how that feels. And so it wasn't that they didn't want people to come. What they wanted is they wanted somebody to acknowledge that there was an unfairness here, because as they quite rightly said, the nice areas, they don't have to put up with this. They don't have to deal with, they don't have to have, 30 or 40 men hanging around the streets all day with nothing to do. Because remember, these people are just dumped. No support, nothing. Just, this is a housing block, you live there. And obviously, they were mostly men. They were on the streets in the day, talking to each other and interacting with local women who did not want to be interacted with. And that's fine. If women don't want to be interacted with, that is fine. And so what they were doing is making complaints about this, and the local council was then telling them to stop being racist. And so then obviously tension started to rise. And these are issues that are very, very difficult to discuss. But, when the liberal middle class, the Labour, the Labour politicians are the worst. When they're sort of saying, we must, we're going to have, I remember Yvette Cooper saying that she was going to have a refugee in her spare bedroom. No, this is not the reality. That's not what's going to happen. And they know this, and the people that live on the estates and are already suffering, they know this as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that statement, as you say, from Yvette Cooper and other politicians, it's also not the bloody point either. But we could talk on the subject for ages, and I think we could probably if we had an hour, we could do hours just on this. But also, I mean, we have a problem, and I've said this before, I think, as a species as well, that predates capitalism, it goes back to the formation of societies generally, where we are always going to have these sort of situations and these symptoms of the illness, because the illness is that we have become accustomed to living in hierarchies of ultimately as a species, where we are used to and we accept a small group of people telling the rest of us what to do. And I think, and situations like this is a sort of symptom of that illness. But I want to move on because we need to go on to story number 2. But it ties into this again, really, as well. And this is a really interesting report and piece of research that was done by 2 people I believe you used to work with at the London School of Economics. And it's called the class ceiling. Now, you explain to the listeners at home what this piece of research was about, because you're heavily involved in this area of sort of sociology and ethnography as well, really. So what was the class ceiling research about?
Well, the class ceiling research has been undertaken by 2 of my ex-colleagues that I worked at the London School of Economics with, Daniel Lorison and Sam Friedman. And it is I've got to say, it's a fantastic piece of research. I remember when they were doing it. Their research is quite different to mine because they deal with a lot of statistics and numbers. The interviews that they do are sort of structured interviews. I'm an ethnographer. I do something very different. But what they managed to do is interview a lot of people through surveys and structures, and Sam did all the interviews, and Daniel crunched all the numbers. And so what they were doing is they were using both interviews and numbers. And what they've found out, and actually for most of us this is not anything new, we all knew this already, but policymakers, newspaper journalists, they need numbers. They can't listen, when sort of everyday working class people are saying, hang on a minute, this is not fair. That's not enough. So, me doing ethnography, writing things and saying this is not fair, somehow that's not good enough.
It's not good. Your lived experience is not good enough, Lisa Mckenzie.
Well, no, it's never my lived experience, my family's, my community, never good enough. So what they always need is they need experts, particularly from places like the London School of Economics, to do research and crunch numbers. And so my colleagues, Daniel and Sam, have done that. And actually, they've made a fantastic job of it. It's a bloody good job what they've done. And what they've found out is that they've only focused on elite jobs. So actually, they've not focused on all the, on most of working class people. They've only focused on the working class that get into elite jobs. So it's things like top academics, actors, lawyers, doctors. And what they've found is even when working class people get into those jobs, they are still not paid the same as middle class people. They're also less likely to get the promotions to the top jobs. And what they found out is actually there really is a class ceiling. That everything about being working class, your accent, your manners, your values, your family, they call it class baggage. I mean, I call it my family. Well, these things are class baggage. Your family is class baggage. Your accent is class baggage. What kind of earrings you like to wear is class baggage. I call it, this is, who I am. So obviously what happens is who you are then is never good enough. So what they did is focus on the top jobs. And so working class people, unless they are prepared to wash away everything that is working class about them, which also includes their family, get rid of your accent, get rid of your working class family, get rid of your working class roots, join the middle class 100%, although you're never ever going to be able to really join them because they'll always know that you're different. And so this is what they found out, and actually it's a brilliant piece of research. The sad thing is number one, I don't think anything's going to change out of it. And number two, like you said, many of us have been saying this for a long time, but it's taken two men from the London School of Economics to crunch numbers before anybody's taken any notice of this.
No, absolutely. And that last sort of statement encapsulates the problem that we still have, because, as you say, no one would listen before when it's actual working class people saying it, no matter what position working class people got to, like yourself, a respected academic. It's not good enough. It does take two people crunching numbers. But I think, as always, you're on the money, as you always are. But I think for me, what the class ceiling report also represents, and what it could go further into, as you will know as well as I, is that this class ceiling exists in every aspect of society. So if I give you a perfect example of what's happening literally to me at the minute with my girlfriend Nicola, she spent 10 years trying to get diagnosed for what she thought was one illness and has now turned into 5 different illnesses. 10 years trying to get diagnosed as a council estate girl who grew up with a family on benefits, and she couldn't get anywhere. She was sectioned under the Mental Health Act as an excuse. She was then told it was all in the head. She was then given one diagnosis which was wrong. Now I come along, and I don't have a kind of broad working class or any kind of accent. I have a fairly flat accent. I'm a journalist, so I can spout off lots of big words when I want to. I come along, in 2 years she's got 5 diagnoses as seen by the top people within the NHS, and suddenly it's all changed. And it is because there's elements of medical misogyny in it, for starters, because she's a woman who wouldn't take no for an answer with regards to her health. But there's also elements of this class ceiling within that as well, that because of her background, essentially because of her postcode, she was dismissed and ignored. Then this class, Nicola calls it classism, essentially, and it's the one.
No, it is right. She's absolutely right. It is classism.
Yeah.
Because I mean, one of the things, if you're talking to what is commonly known as experts, and you're trying, and it's the same thing with the women in St Anne's that I was talking about earlier. They were going to the council, and in their own language and in their own ways were saying, "Listen, we don't like this." The council was saying, "Well, that's not good enough. Say it better." And so now, and it's the same if you go to the doctors or wherever, you're trying to get any help. If you're dealing with the middle class, what they're judging you on is they're judging you on your class. So it is a classism. It absolutely is. And I'm not sure what we can do about this, because, I mean, I've been writing about this for years and years. Because if we kick off, so, for me, so I've read The Class Ceiling. And it is a brilliant piece of research. And my ex-colleagues who have written it are really great researchers. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that as a working class person, what am I supposed to do about this? Am I supposed to take that book to an employer and say, "Listen, employ me, you bastards. Look what you're doing. You're being prejudiced." Because I know that's not going to work.
Yeah, and this is exactly the point. What do we do about it? Because I mean, I want to throw just another thing at you as well. Actually, sorry to interrupt, but what do we do about it? Because what has also happened, again, we go back to what we were talking about in the last section. What's also happened since the sort of dawn of neoliberalism and the Thatcher and then Blair era is, again, the working classes have been disbanded not only by identity, but they've also been disbanded by the ability of people now to self-identify their own class. So what you have in essence is that because people now buy their own house and they've got a job where they tell 10 other people what to do, and they watch television shows about decorating, and they go on a foreign holiday twice a year, they now consider themselves middle class, when essentially they're bloody working class people who've got a bit more than other working class people. And this is the other challenge. The working class as an organised group has been so dissipated that the whole notion of what it is to be working class is gone, and people who are working class don't even consider themselves that anymore. So they'd be like, well, that doesn't apply to me. Do you know what I mean?
No. I mean, the problem is, and that what you're saying there, what I think you're saying there is quite a common. If being working class means that you are stupid, you're not a go-getter, you failed, then why would you identify as working class? And that's the problem. When middle class is seen as success, and working class is seen as failure, you're not going to self-identify as working class, are you? And so that's why I bang on constantly about saying things like, I'm a working class academic. And people have, and I've had Toby Young and Dimbleby and all sorts of people questioning me, you know, on social media, but also in person as well, saying things like, how can you be a working class academic? Those two things don't go. Well, actually, what I say is working class people can read books. Because if you're saying that everything about being working class is failure, then why are you going to identify as working class? So my whole, I suppose, politics around class is that working class people can be who they are. They can talk with an accent. They can want to live on the same street as their mum and dad if that's what they want to do. You know, they don't need to go off to university. They could, but that doesn't make them less than. And so for me, that's why I think The Class Ceiling is an important book, but I'm not sure what it's going to do, because what are we going to do now? Because, you know, if we shout and we get angry about this, what happens is they will further stigmatise us and say, look at these angry working class people. So what are we doing? Have we got to wait for the charity of the middle class to say, oh, we're really sorry, we've wronged you? Because I'm not really into charity.
No, exactly. But you know as well as I do, though, this is the position they are trying to force us into as well. Not least with universal credit, for example. But there is a move, and it's an organised move from the establishment, obviously more over the Conservative Party and the sort of crony capitalists around it. But there is a move to force the working classes now into that kind of position where we're back to a sort of Victorian era, kind of reliant on philanthropy and the goodwill of our betters. And people that don't believe this is happening, but you can see it gradually happening, and it's ending up that we're heading towards more of an underclass than even the working class now in some respects.
Well, you want me to give you an example of that?
Yeah.
And this gives you a real example of this. So I've been talking for a long time about deindustrialised people, devalued people as well, and then devalued places. So if I think back to where I'm from, which is the Nottinghamshire mining communities, those mining communities and all the factories that were there were closed in the late 80s, early 90s, and those places got left. And that's when the buses stopped. There was no community. They absolutely got abandoned. Recently, in the last 7 years perhaps, these massive warehouses like Boohoo, Sports Direct, Amazon are going there through... they're being funded, actually. They're getting funding to go. They're getting all sorts of tax breaks to set these big warehouses up. And so what's happening is they need the workforce. And I think that is what's happening in London and in the cities. The poorest people are being moved out to the poorest areas, and then there's work that is the worst exploitation. And I think this is not accident, it's design.
Yeah, I
this
completely
is not
agree.
This is design. This is about getting the poorest and easily exploited workforce, and that includes migrants, because most of these warehouses are full of Eastern European migrants who are being absolutely exploited in Sports Direct, in Amazon and in Boohoo. And so what we're doing now is we're recognising that there are areas of high value where high value people can be, but then the low value people, whoever they may be, and like I said, there's a whole range of people who are low value, including people who are disabled, are being moved out, and they're being left and abandoned.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened, and it's fucking by design, because as I said, you see it with universal credit, because I've done loads of research around universal credit and where it comes from and who designed it and the thinking behind it, and it came from a group of people who were, in no uncertain terms, Christian fundamentalists who believed that poverty was the cause of poverty was caused by 5 pathways, which were essentially the people's fault that they were on these pathways, which has led them to poverty, and that they either helped themselves out of it or they were on universal credit. This is Victorian era Christian fundamentalist thinking, what we are seeing now, and it's just a 21st century version where you will have an underclass of people on universal credit who are abandoned or forgotten about. Then you have the deserving poor, which is essentially again what this is. You have the deserving, undeserving poor. You have the deserving poor who are lucky enough to have a job in a boohoo fucking warehouse, scraping by and just getting a few pennies to sustain their meagre existence. That is essentially what we are seeing.
And that's why we have to keep talking about this term working class, because what we have no underclass. The underclass doesn't exist.
No,
the underclass are the working class who are not working because of the capitalist system. So what we need to say, we need to not let them do this. So people who are on benefits or people who are disabled, they're not underclass, they're working class people. They're working class people that can't work in the capitalist system. Now that's something wrong with the system, not the people. And unfortunately, like you said, these sort of this thinking, and it goes right from the right wing to the left wing, because the Fabians were really into this as well, which is about, they want to get rid of poverty, but they think they can get rid of poverty by getting rid of the poor.
Exactly. It is essentially modern day eugenics, and you see it with like the two child limit on tax credits. What the fuck else is that, Lisa, apart from eugenics, trying to stop poor people breeding?
It's absolutely eugenic. I mean, it is a new eugenics. The class cleansing in London, the social cleansing throughout the country, moving people into the poorest areas, moving disabled people out of cities. That is absolutely eugenic. It's a eugenicist movement. You know, it actually chimes closer with the sort of Fabian movement, because they really, the Fabians were really interested in how, particularly around women, what were the women doing that was causing them poverty? And this is where, I mean, social work, the whole, social work came out of this idea.
Don't even get me started on that.
Me and you can go on. Left wing, philanthropic, posh, middle class women, they started up social work.
No, I know. Look, we need to move, because this is something we could go on about all day, because I know you and I have written about this a lot, but I'm going to take us on to the final story now, which again, there's a running theme here, and I didn't even realise it when I was laying this section out, but there is a running theme.
Getting rid of people.
Yeah, exactly. This is a running theme. So, of course, in tandem to these two stories this week, the third story that I want to talk about is the one that Twitter said that it wanted us to discuss, which was, of course, the deportation flight to Jamaica, which carried 29 people, all of whom the government said were criminals, the horrendous minor drug offences, and one man who had a terrible driving offence, and who have been deported to Jamaica, many of whom have lived in this country most of their adult life, what interestingly, of course, this happened the night before the Stansted 15 were given suspended sentences. Funny that. No link there at all. Look, Lisa, I mean, the story is fairly well reported. The issue of deportation flights, which was something that I know you were, and I know I was, and a few other people were banging on about years ago, before Windrush even broke, saying that, look, people who have lived here all their lives are being booted out of the country, and no one was interested. It's only when The Guardian get involved that suddenly everyone wants a bit of this story. So this has been going on for ages, so people know the background to this. But I'm interested in your thoughts, because this appears to... For me, this is the government going, essentially, not least because it was the night before the Stansted 15 case, but also because of the whole Windrush scandal generally. This is the government essentially going, fuck you, we'll still do what we want anyway. Do you think, I mean, I think they are, and I'm sure you'll agree, but I have to pose the question. Do you think our government are now beyond being held accountable for Windrush? Is this just going to never be resolved, and those having to be held to account who should be?
No, I think it's a difficult question, really, because the Windrush generation, if we think about just the Windrush generation as the sort of Jamaican and the West Indian community, they have got a strong community here, and people do have some sympathy and some empathy with that community, and I think that's why the Windrush sort of generation has captured the imagination, and I think that's why it's come to the Guardian readership. But in reality, and I think this is the theme for today, is this government and the last government and the government before and possibly the next government sees people as just simply commodities for them to push and shove around, and whoever it may be, whoever is not wanted for whatever reason, I think I think any government in the current climate are going to start pushing people out. Half of my family are Jamaican, so my son's dad, my ex-husband, was Jamaican. My son is half Jamaican, and I've watched, particularly the Jamaican community, been treated like this for the last 30 years, actually. And so this is not new to them in any way. They have been fighting this for years and years. What is new, I suppose, is this sort of narrative and this this new care for what's happening to them. But like you said, there's a real broader point here about the way now that governments can make the argument that these people are not needed. These people are not wanted. So whether that is Jamaicans on a plane going back to Jamaica because, they've committed some offence, or whether it's working class people in London that can't afford to pay £2,000 a month for rent, or whether it's working class people who are trying to get benefits because their job doesn't pay them enough. Whoever it is, this government, and I suppose the administration around it, really thinks that it's got some sort of duty to get rid of people that they don't want, and then make that argument to the rest of the country, saying, listen, we're doing a good thing here. Because this is the thing, what they do. This is what I think the flight to Jamaica really, it struck home, is because they was kind of arguing, saying, we're doing the best thing here, we're doing a good thing. This is a good thing. And then the rest of the country are sort of, they're not sure. People are not sure anymore. They're not sure what, and whose interests anybody's working for. And so I think that's why it's important that we link these things together, because they really are linked. It's about who is valued and who is not valued.
Yeah, spot on, exactly. I mean, my thing is always, Lisa, joining dots, because until you join all the dots together, you cannot ever see the full picture. And no, you're spot on. And I mean, for me, the reason why the Windrush sort of situation backfired on them, is, if you like, is because the system. Because I don't want to say the Conservative government, because it's not really them either. They're just the sort of the puppets in all of this, if you like, really, of the actual system. But the Windrush scandal backfired for them, because the system has spent so many now years saying that it's Muslims or people from the Middle East who are the enemy. They're the enemy. We've got to get them out of the country. We must get them out of the country. That suddenly, when they turned around and said, especially people from Jamaica and people of the Windrush generation, suddenly they're the enemy, we were like, well, hang on a minute. You didn't tell us they were the enemy. They're not Muslims. And these are people who live next door to us, and etc., and live in our communities, etc., because I think that, especially the Windrush generation, they're ingratiated in communities now, and there hasn't been that demonisation, and it was a misstep completely by the government and the system to even attempt to pull this off.
No, I agree with you. I mean, and I think that's why it's important that we link these things together, because if we say, oh, this is just about the Windrush generation, or this is just about refugees coming from Syria, or this is just about people on universal credit, or this is about people in London who are homeless. If we make this, if we keep doing this, we've got all these different causes that we're all fighting against each other. because we're all trying to, be heard. Now the problem is this is the same issue, and I keep coming back to it all the time. This is about what happens when you have a society, a capitalist society, a neoliberal society that values people on wealth and worth. And so therefore everybody that is not, there's, I could tell you about reports and pieces of research that Savills have pulled forward that tells you exactly how much you've got to earn to live in different parts of the country. In London, it's £70,000. If you're not earning £70,000, you're a waste of space. In Barnsley, it's £18,000. And so therefore, this is what happens when you purely value people on monetary wealth. You get flights sending people off to places that they've never lived. You've got women stuck in communities with no control over their lives at all. We have people that are disabled, that need support, that are getting all benefits pulled away from them because they're seen as just not worth it. And this is why I think we have to link these things together. And I think it's really important we do that and not say these are separate issues. None of these are separate issues. They are linked by exploitation.
Exactly. No, and I completely agree with you. For me, what links them all is the way I view all of these issues and everything else that's going on in the minute. It is essentially the system and the advocates and the gatekeepers of the system now marching more towards this almost dystopian, because it is dystopian. It's absolutely dystopian what's going on. Science fiction writers would ejaculate in their pants to have a storyline like this, because it is essentially dystopian. What we're seeing is the gatekeepers of the system are now getting us to that stage where we are separated off into those, as you say, which are of value in any small way, shape or form to the system and to keep it maintained. Because let's bear in mind as well, the system is essentially nursery and is based on debt, which is not infinite. This is finite, and I think the system is slowly beginning to creak under its own corrupt weight. But we are essentially seeing the siphoning off of those who are of a small incremental amount of value, who can do something to keep the system going, and everyone else. And as you say, that covers people from immigrants to refugees to working class women to disabled people to those with mental health issues to homeless people to whatever. Those lot, goodbye, we don't want to think about you. You are left at the hands of charities. That is essentially what's happening, and you're spot on. Moreover, we have to link the dots together because this is such a huge issue. This is not an issue that can be tackled just by the UK and just by electing Jeremy Corbyn, because that's really going to sort things out. This is a species level problem that we have to solve globally, and it concerns me. I'm not sure that we are unfortunately up to the job as a species yet to even begin solving it. But anyway, that's what I think.
No, I don't. I don't want to be nihilist about this, because I do find that there is lots of hope there as well. I'm like you said, I'm an activist. I work with lots of activist groups, and I see lots of hope in there as well. People that are seeing this very clearly. Me and you are having this conversation, so this is hopeful. Yeah. So it's not, so I don't think we should be too nihilistic about it, because people know that this is happening. So I think the positive that we need to take from this is that, yes, we've got to start linking the dots. Yeah, we've got to start talking about it more openly. And we've got to really start challenging and pressurising, all of our enemies, no matter where they're coming from, whether they're coming from the ivory towers of Oxford University, or whether they're coming from the Pilates centres in Islington. Wherever this is coming from, we've got to challenge this.
Yeah. No, I know, exactly. And listeners at home, I suggest you listen to Lisa Mckenzie, because she is far more half glass full than I am on this. But no, Lisa is right, of course. We do have to challenge this. And however, we could go on for hours about this, and I'm not sure we quite get to the solution, but we have at least presented some of the issues, and hopefully people at home will have a deeper understanding and start connecting those bloody dots themselves. Lisa Mckenzie, it was a real treat to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It was brilliant to be on it.
Thank you, and please come back on again. Lisa Mckenzie, thank you.